Thanks very much, Bob, and good evening to you all. Tonight, I'm delighted that our presenter is John Ashton CBE, but he was introduced to me by TLC Vice President Lord Kim Darroch. And I'm going to pass over now to Kim to do the introduction, as he knows John infinitely better than I do and can give us a little bit of a background, and then we look forward to hearing from John. So over to you, Kim, if you'd be kind enough.
Steve, thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to introduce John this evening, because he's been a friend of mine. I was thinking 45 years, but actually it's a little bit longer than that. We both joined the Foreign Office in the same year, I think it was 1977. And we were, in that generation, the only two scientists there. I was from the sort of fluffy, cuddly end of science because I was a zoologist. And John was from the brainy end because he was basically an astrophysicist. He did what the very, very clever people in the Foreign Office are sent off to do, which is learn Chinese, which he still speaks fluently. He went off to Beijing, Peking, as it was then called, in the early 80s. My wife and I went and visited him there in 82, I think. And then later in his career, he was in Hong Kong working for Chris Patton during the handover of Hong Kong to China. So huge amount of China experience. And had he stayed in the Foreign Office, I guess now he might be British ambassador in China. But instead, because he was one of the early recognizers of the threat of climate change, he left the FCO to found and run a leading environmental think tank called E3G. I think this was in the very early 2000s. The reputation of that think tank was established so quickly and so prominently that he was called back into government service in 2006 to be the Foreign Secretary's special representative for climate change. And he actually worked for 3 foreign secretaries. He worked for Margaret Beckett first, then David Miliband, and then, I think as a striking testament to his expertise and what he brought to the job, the Conservatives, when they came in 2010, kept him on, and he worked for William Hague, Foreign Secretary, as well. Thereafter, he left government to be independent analyst and speaker and writer on climate change. He can tell you about all the different campaigns and issues he's involved in, but there is really no one better that you could have as a speaker for the Leaders Club on this problem. And it is something that is affecting all of us. I read only this morning an independent analysis by a very reputable scientific institution said that the terrible weather that we've had in the UK over the winter, with this record rainfall that we've all experienced, not just in North England, but all over, I promise you, is another aspect of the quickening stride of climate change in terms of changing our weather. So, we get daily reminders of what is going on. And as I say, there is no one better to talk us through what is happening and quite how far off governments are from doing what needs to be done to address the problem than John Ashton. So over to John.
Kim, thank you very much for those nice words, all those memories. It doesn't seem like 45 years. Here we are together floating in the ether somewhere above planet Zoom. But for those of you who still have some attachment to the physical world, I should say I'm talking to you tonight from Newcastle upon Tyne, obviously the best city in the United Kingdom. I'm just a stone's throw from a wondrous tract of public savanna, which up here we call the town moor. And the freemen of the city have the ancient right of turning their cows loose for the summer on the town moor. They've just exercise that right. So although Basil Fawlty was perfectly correct to say that you can't see herds of wildebeest from a hotel bedroom window in Torquay, if I had an extra story on my house, I could see English cows grazing contentedly on well-watered grass. Anyway, back to Planet Zoom. I should say just a couple more things, just to expand a little bit on what Kim has kindly said, to help you calibrate what you're going to hear from me. I am indeed an escaped diplomat. And what did I take with me as I escaped? I think just one big thing, really, which is the knowledge that there really is only one way in today's world to take back control. And that's by cooperating with our neighbors and our partners to manage the forces that we have unleashed on the world. They're global forces, they're historic forces. They include climate change, but actually not only climate change. And none of us on our islands, in our societies, in our separate cultures, can be truly sovereign unless we manage those forces, unless we exercise that sovereignty together and in concert. And I also know that you can only do that, you can only cooperate in that way if you do yourself what you're asking other people to do, what you hope other people will do. Rule one of diplomacy, I hope Kim will agree with me, but rule one of diplomacy is walk your talk. Because if you don't do that, nobody's going to listen. Just to jump ahead a little bit, if we want Australia to stop inviting Indian investors to build new mega coal mines in Queensland, it's not a brilliant idea to give a green light to a group of Australian speculators to come and dig coal out of the Irish, out of under the Irish Sea off West Cumbria. Walk your talk. Second thing about me, very briefly, Kim said I was independent. I do my best to be very deliberately. I have no titles these days, no ties to any particular organization. Of course, a kind of parental affection for E3G as a co-founder of it, but I'm not on anybody's, I'm not operationally involved in it, and I'm not on anybody's payroll, and nothing I say is part of any wider lobbying campaign or agenda of any kind. And I know, I think we all know, I can't, nobody can change somebody else's mind. We can only change it, we can only make up our own minds. All we can do is to do our best to say what we think and explain why we think it on the basis of our experience, and hope that's useful as we collectively try and make up our minds together. With that out of the way, climate change really is different. A lot of people claim that their issue is different, but climate change really is different. It has maybe some similarities with war, maybe some similarities with pandemics or with economic crashes, but they're partial similarities. And in at least three respects, climate change is just fundamentally different from any threat, any challenge human beings have ever had to face, certainly in industrial times. First of all, it's implacable. Secondly, it's existential. And thirdly, it's transformational. Those are big words, so I'll explain what I mean by each one. It's implacable because what's happening is that we're kicking against nature, and nature is kicking back. And the laws of nature don't particularly care about our laws or our desires. The laws of nature are fixed. So we can negotiate as much as we like with each other. That's how politics works. It's a perpetual negotiation. But we can't negotiate with the climate. So when you hear people say we need to slow down, we need to be pragmatic, they can say that, but they really ought to say as well why they think it's acceptable for us to accept the extra climate change that we're going to inflict on everybody by acting more slowly, by being more pragmatic. The truth is that for every ton of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere, every extra ton, we're leaving behind the climate that we could have had we not put it into the atmosphere. It's a one-way journey. Why is it existential? Well, Kim will tell you if you ask him, I hope, that I'm one of life's optimists. And as an optimist, I'm pretty skeptical about the argument that climate change threatens the extinction of humanity. In the end, we're quite a resilient species. I'm not sure about that. It could, but I'm skeptical about it. My optimistic view is that what is under threat is what we loosely call and think of as civilization, which is now in a globalized, interdependent world, essentially a single global civilization. You can't have food security, you can't have water security, you can't have energy security unless you have climate security. And if you don't have those things, the foundations on which civilization rests crumble away. So that's why it's existential. It's also transformational because what we need to do is to get very quickly in the space of a single generation, a single investment cycle for major infrastructure. We need to get from a fossil-based energy system to a net zero energy system. And there's no way of doing that gently and quietly and by stealth, by driving change at the margin. If you just think for a moment, what is the economy? The economy is a mechanism whereby we take stuff and we use energy to transform it into other stuff and to move it around. Energy is right at the heart of the economy. So if you reconfigure the energy system, you're reconfiguring the economy. And that's actually not an economic project, that's a political project, as I'll come to. And there's a sting in the tail because the choice is not between transformation or staying the same. The choice is between the transformation that you get if you respond to the climate problem and get very quickly to net zero, or not responding, which includes not responding fast enough, and suffering the transformation that you're going to get, which in many places people are already feeling quite dramatically in consequence of climate change itself. We already have seriously disruptive climate change. The issue is, can we avoid catastrophic climate change? We've wasted a generation. We could have given ourselves a bit more time. One of my favorite political quotes is the Victorian historian Carlyle, who said, "If a thing be not done, it will do itself, and in a way that pleases no one." I've been involved in this issue one way or another in the politics and politics and diplomacy of climate change, the subject on the card. I've been involved in it, as Kim implied, for 30 years or so. It was actually Chris Patton who gave me the first advice, said I wanted to find something interesting to do after working for him in Hong Kong. And he said, well, try climate diplomacy. And I'm very glad I followed his advice. How far have we got in those 30 years? Well, the good news is that compared with where we started from, we've come quite a long way. Not least in political salience. The Scottish government has just changed because it was making a mess of its climate policy, for example. But there's bad news. The bad news is worse than the good news is good, because the bad news is, compared with where we need to get to and how quickly we need to get there, we've hardly started. We're failing to deal with climate change so far. And if you doubt that, last week, the scientists who measure on the top of a mountain in Hawaii, the annual increase in year by year in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have just announced that it's gone up by more than it's ever gone up by before in a single year, 4.7 parts per million, if that helps. A little bit of that might be the tail end of a COVID bounce back, but most of it is because although we're now growing the net zero economy, as a world, we're still growing the fossil energy economy faster than the net zero one. So, as I say, we're failing. We shouldn't beat ourselves up too much about that, because, as I said, this is an unprecedented problem, and it's a very hard problem. We've never been called to do the kind of things we need to do in the face of climate change. But if we're going to do them, first of all, we need to be honest. We can't pretend that we're doing better than we are. And then we have to ask, how can we very quickly get from a path of failure to a path of success? And if we want to do that, we have to start by interrogating ourselves a bit more about the causes of failure. Why are we failing? It's easier to say where the causes do not lie. We're not failing because we don't understand the problem. The scientists have been telling us for all of those 30 years. We knew as much as we needed to know, actually, pretty much almost 30, maybe 20 years ago, even 30 years ago. We're not very good at listening to scientists. And a lot of the scientists have been, how can I put it? They have been very cautious in public because they're scared of being accused of alarmism, because those who do not want to embark on this journey have been very quick to accuse them of alarmism just for calling it as it is. And so that voice has been weak. But we know what we need to do. We know what climate change is going to do to us if we just sit back and roll over. We're not failing because we don't have the technologies and the infrastructures we need. Nearly all of those are available or within reach, and we know what to do to make them available. We know how to build a net zero electricity system, how to build a net zero transport system, how to get to net zero housing, net zero industry. There are one or two areas of difficulty. Aviation is one in transport, and one or two industries, cement, for example, are difficult. But there's no reason to think that in technology terms, we don't have the wherewithal now to get to where we need to get to as quickly as we need to get there. Nor is it a problem of whether we can afford it. We actually know also now that we can afford it. First of all, it's a cliche almost to say the costs of climate change itself are now far more daunting than the cost of doing anything about it. But the cost of doing anything about it have fallen dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. Look at what's happened, for example, with offshore wind in the UK, with the very successful policy that we've had to facilitate that. And governments understand now, they didn't understand this 10, 15 years ago. Then they looked at the cost of doing particular things, the cost of different technologies if you bring them on more quickly than the market would. Now they understand that the issue isn't the cost today. Every technology has a cost curve. Every set of technologies has a cost curve. The issue is, what can government do using public policy to drive technologies down that cost curve more quickly? We know a lot more about that than we used to. And as I say, we're wealthy enough in the UK, and we're wealthy enough as a world. We actually spend more on subsidizing fossil fuels globally than we would need to invest in the transition to make it happen quickly. So we're not short of policies. Sorry, we're not short of policies either. We have policies coming out of our ears. Almost every conceivable policy has been tried in one place or another. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work in different cultures. The issue isn't the policies, it's the level of ambition at which they're applied. And the level of ambition for policy is not a policy matter, it's a political matter. And that's why this is a political problem before it's any other kind of problem. What do I mean by that? Well, any change, any big change in particular, has winners and losers. The winners from the change are the people who have an immediate direct interest in that change happening. The global tourism industry, before COVID, the biggest global industry was tourism. And tourism is getting hammered by the consequences of climate change in all kinds of ways, from damage to coral reefs to damage to ski resorts, lack of snow. But the voice of the tourist industry is pretty disparate. It's very fragmented. It's not a single organized political force. The renewables industry, it's growing, but it's got a weak voice at the moment. And on the other side, you have losers, what I would call the incumbents, people whose interests are intimately tied up with the status quo. On the whole, the losers are the people who are already embedded in political decision making. They have a loud voice, they have resources, they know where the levers are and how to pull them in their interests. And what we have, I think, is a classic political struggle. A Marxist would recognize it, between the forces of transformation on one side, they're still quite weak, but gathering, and the forces of the status quo on the other, which are strong and determined to cling to their position for as long as possible, maybe not to stop the transition, but to slow it down. And in this game, to win slowly is to lose. There's a general point also to make, which is that there's a natural human instinct to cling to the familiar. This is about leaving the familiar behind, setting off to somewhere else that we don't really know, we don't really understand. And people quite naturally need to have a very good idea of why they're being asked to do that before they will embark on it. Let me say a word or two about what I mean by incumbencies, just to give a few examples. The obvious example, I suppose, is the oil and gas industry. I don't know whether there's anybody here tonight from the oil and gas industry. It'd be interesting if there is. But the problem, and I'm not, let me immediately say, I'm not trying to demonize the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry is full of good, public-spirited people who have great expertise and want to do their best, not only for their companies, but for the world. But there is a big problem for oil and gas companies because they have a business model which is fundamentally incompatible with the transition. So the choice they face is either they tear up their business model and build a new one which is compatible with the transition, or they fight the transition. I once asked the chief executive of a major oil company in private about what would be necessary to change the business model of his company. And he said it just couldn't be done. You can't do that. So that means that structurally, those industries are part of the problem, and they can't be part of the solution, at least unless they address that. But that'll hit their share price and their dividends. And there's no way around that. So that's a problem for public policy. It's something that we have to grapple with together and not just leave to those companies themselves. Let me give another example. In my time on the front line of climate policy, there was no organization, no institution that was more of an obstacle to progress in British policy than Her Majesty's Treasury. That may sound surprising, but actually, if you think about it for a little bit, it's not, because again, partly at least, it's a question of the business model. One thing the Treasury cares deeply about is the tax base, and we have a tax base in Britain which isn't completely dependent, but is at least significantly dependent on tax revenues from the production and consumption of oil and gas and related products. Think of fuel duty. I remember asking Treasury officials, they got sick of me asking, what are you going to do to replace the proportion of your tax take that those bits of taxation represent? What they could have said is, well, let's get together and make a plan, or even we'll get together in our own little huddle and make a plan. What they actually said was, we can't hear you, in effect. They put their fingers in their ears and said, la, la, la. They also know And I think that may be changing now, but for a long time it's been a problem. They also know that the UK financial services sector, the financial industries, are deeply intertwined with fossil fuels. I haven't checked recently, but when I last looked, I think something like 20% of the of pension incomes were accounted for by dividends from fossil fuel companies. So if I say we need to extinguish the business model of fossil fuel companies altogether, all of a sudden, it's not just those companies that are incumbent, it's everybody who's worried about their pension, including me, actually. It's deeply intertwined in a capillary way, and because the Treasury, as it were, owns those industries in Whitehall, that's something that the Treasury, I think, was deeply conscious of. I think it's also fair to say, people talk about the Treasury view. The Treasury had a view of the economy which was fundamentally incompatible with what was needed. It was not in the Treasury view for government to dictate the outcomes, the structural outcomes that our economy should be generating. That primarily should be left to the market, and government should only intervene when there was a market failure. That doesn't work for driving this kind of transition that we need. And that leads me to a wider incumbency problem, if I can put it like that. And that's a question really of dogma, or ideology, to be a bit more polite about it. We've lived, many of us, most of our adult lives through the Thatcher-Reagan era and the post-1989 fall of the end of the Cold War era. There was a time after the war, before that, where the dominant ideology was sort of quasi-Keynesian. It allowed at least for a bigger role of government in shaping economic outcomes. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that really collapsed. And right across politics, not just on the right, but on the left, at least the center left, the idea has sort of crystallized. It's got various names, various labels you can put on it: neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, Washington consensus, if you want to talk in international terms, but ideas that say basically the market knows best. Government should, the public voice, government shouldn't dictate outcomes. Government should be as small as possible. Tax and regulation, on the whole, are bad things rather than good things. And if you do have to intervene at all, use market mechanisms. It's worth, because we sometimes talk about carbon prices and carbon trading, market mechanisms can drive change at the margin. They are by definition and by design instruments for marginal change. They're not drivers of transformational change. And I think in this transition, they have a secondary role to play, perhaps, but certainly not a primary role. That, I'll call it neoliberal, that dogma came into sharp relief in 2008 with the financial crash. People suddenly realized there was no room within that dogma for the idea of resilience, for the idea that you should invest publicly to build resilience against shocks. And so we had a big shock, and actually some of the negative consequences of that shock are still playing through the system. I think the rise of populist nativist voices across Europe has a lot to do with the consequences of it. So that ideology, at least in the form that it applied before 2008, is dead. It's no longer fit for purpose, and it's certainly not fit. You can't accommodate what we need to do about climate change within it. But the problem is that its successor has yet to emerge. And in that gap, it's still exerting, I don't want to put this too colorfully, but it's still exerting a kind of zombie grip with cold, clammy hands around the jugular veins of not just of the economy, but of politics. As I say, on left and right. Here in the UK, of course, the Conservative Party has pretty much abandoned any serious effort to get to net. They say they haven't, but if you look at what they're actually advocating and the political narrative they're building it around, they basically positioned themselves as an anti net zero party, and the contrary voices within them have been silenced. But even the Labour Party is at least trying to look as if it's part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But even Labour is treating climate change as if it's another policy on some kind of giant spreadsheet with lots of policies that can be tuned up or down according to political expediency. And that shows that they haven't really understood it politically. Just to express that in a kind of headline, you really can't. It's a sign that you don't understand this problem if you think that you can buy fiscal credibility at the expense of climate credibility. The fact is, we will need tens of billions of pounds of public investment a year to leverage larger flows of private investment starting now, and to walk away from that pledge is not a good sign in terms of Labour policy. So I'm sort of, I don't want to sound too partisan here, but it shows that neither side of our politics has yet really internalized this challenge for the political mission it really needs to represent. And again, don't misunderstand me. I talk about bigger government, but I'm not trying to impose some kind of top-down Stalinist nightmare on everybody. Some of you might be relieved to hear that. I don't think you can do this in anything other than a democracy. You can't drive it globally unless the democracies are doing that, because you need public consent. You need to mobilize people, you need to inspire people, you need to build a sense of collective purpose. And you can't do that top down. That won't happen if it's something you do to people. You have to do it with people. So we need something that we just haven't explored before. There's a lot more I could say about this issue. I could talk about China. We could talk about America. With a bit of help from Kim, I'm sure. We could talk about the United Nations climate negotiations and the wider question of whether multilateral cooperation can be resuscitated. It seems to be in a pretty parlous state at the moment, even though we know we can only solve global problems if we cooperate to solve them. But there is one more thing I want to talk about before I finish, because transformational politics needs transformational leadership, and it seems to me you're a leaders club, so I guess I'm in the right place to say a word or two and share a word or two, share a discussion about transformational leadership, because I think there's a deeper problem here in Britain and actually in many countries, and the deeper problem is it's not just that climate politics isn't working. The deeper problem is that politics isn't working. What I mean by that is I don't think many people would argue that politics in its current form is effectively delivering the public goods that we expect in return for the taxes that we pay. You're welcome to disagree. Raise a hand on Zoom if you disagree, or raise it afterwards. But certainly up here in Newcastle, I frequently ask people if they think that politics is working, and I don't think I've ever had in the last few months anybody telling me that they think it is. And the reality is we are a more divided country, we're a more disgruntled country, we're a more disoriented country than we've ever been in my lifetime. When I was my son's age, I felt as if I was on an upwards escalator, and that my generation could pretty much take it for granted that our lives would be at least as good as our parents, or the lives that our parents were looking forward to when they were our age. I don't think many young people in Britain today feel the same. They worried that their lives will be worse, perhaps a lot worse. You meet a lot of people who've decided not to have children because they don't want to bring new life into a world with these kind of unsolved problems. If you think about that's a tragic thing to hear when people say that to you. So if we want to fix climate politics, the first thing we need to do is to fix politics. And in the end, that's about trust. You can't do anything without trust, and it's trust that has broken down. And what is breaking down now is the common language that you need to build trust, to keep trust in good condition, and the shared experience that underpins that common language. The leader of a major European political party once said to me in private that they didn't think in their country there was any such thing anymore as a national conversation. There are conversations. There's a political media conversation inside the bubble, the mutually reinforcing mirrors that comprise the political media world. But there isn't a national conversation in the country concerned, but I would apply it here as well. There isn't a national conversation out of which we can build common purpose and a sense of new direction and renewal. And I think that's a challenge for anybody who wants to think of themselves as a leader. When politics as a profession isn't working, we all have to be politicians. We can either moan about them or we can do something about it. And so whatever walk of life you're in, whatever organization you have a leadership position in, it's not enough to say any longer, how can I protect my share price? How can I see off the next shareholder revolt? How can I keep my customers locked in, even if they aren't terribly happy? And there are a lot of unhappy customers in Britain today. How can I keep at bay policymakers who want to change the ground rules in a way that might undermine my business model? The question is, how can I lead an organization that continues to flourish while at the same time making sure that it contributes to the wider public interest and communicating that contribution? Because I think publics around Europe don't think that a lot of their institutions at the moment are contributing to that wider public interest. When they face problems, they're closing ranks and defending their brand. For heaven's sake, in a week where we've had not one, but 2 public inquiries in Britain, which cast really serious question marks over the quality of leadership in some of our big institutions, that seems to me a pretty salient question. So, I mean, just to wrap up, I think, what does it mean to be a real leader in those circumstances? A real leader knows that it's not enough to do a good job within the realm of the familiar. This is a changing world. The familiar is going to move itself if you don't move out of it. So you have to get outside that realm, to get outside your comfort zone and bring people with you. And you also, as you do that, you also know, I think, that as soon as you leave your comfort zone, what you're saying is, yes, I accept the challenge. I take responsibility for the wider consequences of the decisions I'm taking. And I accept the challenge of trying to change things, not just in the interest of my organization, but in the wider public interest. But I also know that by electing myself to change the world around me, I have to open myself up to the equal and opposite reaction, to finding that change changes me. The hardest thing in the world is to open yourself up to that change. I sat on my chair, utterly gripped for a while today, listening to Paula Venels demonstrating how difficult it is to accept that you have to change. But that's the reality that we now all face with a problem like climate change. So what it really means is none of us any longer are in the audience. We're all on the stage. We're all players, if you like, in the great play. And whether you're standing tall in your organization or in your private life, this is something which is not about what you do. This is about who you are. And I think that's for now the end of the sermon. So if you've been staying with me, thank you very much for that.